They said a man born in dust could never touch silk, that a tailor with empty pockets had no place dreaming of queens. But they never saw what the knight saw, a boy whose hands refused to surrender, who stitched his grief into cloth until his pain began to shine. They mocked my poverty, but what they didn't know was that destiny has its own tailor. And that night, she began sewing my name into a royal seam I couldn't yet see. The night I began to believe again didn't come with stars. It came with silence. The kind of silence that hums like an old wound, like the air itself is remembering your failures. My tiny wooden hut, leaning crooked against the edge of the market, was filled with the scent of candle wax and old fabric. My fingers moved the way they always had, steady, careful, worn, sewing together torn sleeves for people who never bothered to remember my name. The market outside had gone quiet. The fires had burned out, and only the echoes of laughter remained, laughter that used to sting like needles in my chest. I was the poor tailor, the one who mended others' dreams while my own stayed unstitched. Sometimes, when no one came, I'd sit by the window and watch the palace lights on the horizon, small, golden, untouchable. My mother once said that light was a promise. I had long stopped believing her, but that evening, the promise returned, not as light, but as sound. It began as a faint rhythm in the distance, the sharp strike of hooves against dry ground. Slow at first, then steady, echoing through the sleeping market. The dogs began to bark, the wind shifted, and the night seemed to lean closer, listening. I stood, heart pounding, unsure whether to hide or wait. My hand hovered near the oil lamp, but before I could blow it out, the sound stopped, right outside my door. Then came the knock, 3 times. Not hurried, not harsh, intentional. I opened the door and found him standing there, a man cloaked in deep blue, his clothes too fine for a place that smelled of dust and rain. His horse stood behind him, its breath steaming in the cold. The man's face was hidden beneath a hood, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command and the echo of secrecy. "Are you Kofi, the tailor?" I nodded, though my throat had gone dry. "Yes, sir, I am." He studied me for a long moment, his gaze sharp but unreadable. Then, from beneath his cloak, he drew something that caught the light, a letter sealed in gold. My heart faltered. I had only ever seen such seals from a distance, pressed on royal decrees pinned to the gates of the city. "This letter," he said slowly, "is to be placed in your hands, alone. Guard it well, and speak of it to no one." He handed it to me, and for a second I was too afraid to touch it. My hands were rough, calloused, and trembling. The seal gleamed like a tiny sun, its edges carved with the royal crest. 2 lions, their claws circling a crown. "Sir, there must be some mistake," I stammered. "I mend torn shirts for traders. I cannot possibly be—" The man's tone hardened. "The palace does not make mistakes." He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and vanished into the night, his cloak fluttering like the wings of a shadow. The silence that followed felt heavier than any noise. I stared at the letter in my hands, afraid to breathe. The wax shimmered in the lamplight, and my reflection trembled across its gold surface. The face of a man who had nothing, now holding something the world could kill for. I didn't open it right away. I sat there, the letter burning against my palm, remembering my mother's voice, her last words before sickness took her. "One day, Kofi," she'd said, "your stitches will hold more than cloth. They'll hold the world's attention." That night, her prophecy returned, wrapped in royal wax. When I finally broke the seal, my eyes struggled to read through the blur of disbelief. It was an invitation. No, a command to present myself before the royal committee. The queen herself was commissioning the creation of her wedding dress. Tailors from across the kingdom would compete for the honor. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My heart beat so loud it drowned the wind. I pressed the letter to my chest, half laughing, half crying, whispering into the darkness. Mother, they called me mad, but look, your son is being summoned by the crown. Outside, the moon climbed higher, its light falling softly on my torn tablecloth, the same one I had been patching hours earlier. I touched it, and for the first time, I saw beauty in imperfection. I saw the journey in every scar. Maybe the gods had been listening all along, not to my prayers, but to the sound of my needle piercing through despair. As dawn crept over the hills, I pinned the royal seal to my wall. The gold caught the morning light, bathing my hut in a glow it had never known. But somewhere deep inside, fear stirred, quiet, certain. I didn't yet understand that the same letter which opened a door to the palace also unlocked every trap laid behind it. They say destiny speaks in thunder, but sometimes it whispers through paper. That letter didn't just arrive, it breathed. Its seal shimmered like sunlight trapped in gold, its weight heavier than any coin I'd ever held. I didn't know it then, but that single-folded parchment carried both my rise and my ruin, a promise written in ink and a warning written between the lines. The morning light spilled through the cracks in my hut, painting the table where the letter lay. For the first time in years, my hands were afraid to move. They had stitched torn shirts, patched beggars' robes, and held my dying mother's hand. But never had they touched something that smelled of power. The gold seal caught the light again, and for a heartbeat, it felt like my mother's spirit was watching through it, whispering, "Be careful, Kofi. Not every door that opens wants you to walk through." I broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside, the ink shimmered like oil on water, the handwriting elegant, royal. By decree of Her Majesty's Council, the Crown calls upon the finest tailors across the realm to design the wedding gown of the Queen-to-be. The chosen designer shall be granted lifelong service to the royal house and the title of court artisan. I read it once, twice, again and again until my eyes blurred. My chest tightened with something I hadn't felt in years. Belief. Maybe my mother's prayer hadn't been lost after all. Maybe every stitch I'd sewn in hunger and humiliation had been leading here. But faith has sharp edges, for as soon as hope bloomed, a shadow followed it. Dio. The name alone made the candlelight tremble. He wasn't just any tailor. He was the golden boy of the capital, the man whose smile could buy silence and whose lies were stitched in silk. Years ago, he'd stolen my designs, my apprenticeship, my chance at dignity, and turned them into his throne. I'd heard whispers that he now sat beside royalty, the Queen's favorite designer. And now, he would be competing against me. I packed my tools that night with shaking hands, my mother's rusted scissors, my wooden tape, my spool of red thread that had never run out no matter how many times I thought it would. I tucked the letter in my shirt pocket and whispered to the shadows, "If this is madness, let it be the kind that changes something." The journey to the capital was a blur of red earth and rising dust. I walked most of the way, my sandals tearing, my body aching, but my heart burning. The palace city rose before me like a dream carved from sunlight and marble, its towers piercing the sky. I had never seen such beauty. It frightened me. The registration hall loomed ahead, white stone, guards in gold armor, and banners fluttering like the wings of angels. Inside, the air smelled of perfume, arrogance, and expensive ink. Tailors in embroidered robes filled the room, their laughter sharp, their gazes sharper. One of them sneered when he saw me. "Who let the market tailor in? Did he come to mend our boots?" Their laughter rippled through the room. I ignored it, stepping toward the desk where a clerk sat, head bowed, her quill scratching across parchment. "Name?" she asked, without looking up. "Kofi," I said quietly. "Affiliation?" "Independent." That made her pause. She finally looked up, her painted eyes narrowing. "And your invitation." I handed her the letter. For a second, the room seemed to hold its breath. The seal caught the sunlight streaming through the high windows. Her tone shifted. "Wait here," she said, voice suddenly careful. When she returned, she handed me a token engraved with a number. "You're registered. The review begins tomorrow." But before I could thank her, a voice like silk dipped in poison brushed past my ear. Well, well, if it isn't Kofi. My breath caught. I turned, and there he was, Dio, dressed in royal blue trimmed with gold, his hair slicked back, his smile that same blade that had cut me years ago. He looked at me the way kings look at servants. "I didn't think you'd crawl this far," he said softly. "Still chasing dreams with those broken hands?" I met his gaze, swallowing my anger. "Maybe. But some dreams don't die just because others are afraid of them." His smirk deepened. "You'll learn that this place doesn't reward faith. It rewards power." He stepped closer, his perfume heavy, suffocating. "And I have both." He walked away, his laughter echoing against the marble walls. But as he passed a group of guards, he leaned in and whispered something. Their faces changed. One nodded. My stomach turned cold. Hours later, as I prepared to leave, I passed the corridor behind the registration desk and froze. Dio's voice drifted through the shadows, low and venomous. "Make sure the poor man's name disappears before the selection." The guards murmured their assent. I backed away, heart pounding. The letter that had promised a crown now pulsed in my pocket like a curse, and I realized that the palace didn't just want a designer, it wanted a sacrifice. Every dream has a price, and mine demanded blood. The day they erased my name from the palace list, I realized that destiny never hands you a crown. It hands you a blade, and waits to see if you'll bleed for it. I learned that night that creation isn't born from talent. It's born from the parts of you the world tries to destroy. When the official list was pinned to the palace gates, the sunlight caught the golden letters. But my name wasn't there. I stood among the crowd, merchants, apprentices, scholars, all craning their necks to glimpse the chosen few. Cheers broke out around me, paper rustled, names were shouted in celebration. Yet through it all, I heard nothing but the echo of my own silence. I didn't need to read twice. I already knew what I'd find. I had never been meant to belong among those names written in royal ink. Behind me, laughter bloomed. Cruel, careless, the kind that always found me wherever I went. "The market tailor thought the queen would wear his rags," someone jeered. Another voice, colder, followed. "They say even his mother stitched her coffin by hand. Maybe he'll sew his own." Their words cut, but they couldn't reach where my mother's voice still lived, whispering from memory. "Kofi, when the world mocks your thread, it's because they fear what you might mend." That night, I sat alone in my hut, the moonlight falling across my work table, illuminating the royal letter still pinned to the wall, a reminder of how close I had come to being seen. The silence pressed on me until it became unbearable. And then, through that quiet ache, a thought emerged. Quiet, sharp, and defiant. If they won't let me inside their palace, I will build mine here. So I began again, not for gold, not for fame, but for proof that my hands were still capable of making something the world could not ignore. I gathered scraps, cloth from market stalls, silks thrown away by wealthier tailors, ribbons discarded in dust. I traded food for thread, promises for fabric. Each piece came from rejection, yet together they formed a strange kind of beauty. My mother used to say, "The gods hide miracles in broken things," and as the first needle pierced through the silk, I felt the truth of her words. The nights bled into one another. I barely slept. The lamp flickered low, painting my face in shades of exhaustion and firelight. My fingers blistered, bled, and healed again, leaving small stains of red on the white cloth. I didn't clean them. I let them stay, a part of me embedded in every seam. The gown began to take shape, not grand, not glittering, but alive. Every fold carried the heartbeat of the forgotten. Sometimes, when I grew too tired to continue, I'd imagine my mother standing beside me, her hands guiding mine, her voice soft as wind. "Don't stop, Kofi. A man's hands may tremble, but his purpose must never shake." And so I sewed through hunger, through fatigue, through the pain of being invisible. The gown grew, shimmering softly under candlelight. Simple, pure, the kind of beauty that didn't shout for attention but whispered to the soul. It was a wedding dress, yes, but it felt more like redemption wearing white. Then came the strange signs. First, I returned one evening to find my spools rearranged. The thread I had left neatly wound was tangled, as if handled by clumsy fingers. Days later, the fabric I'd hidden under my bed was damp, not with rain, but with something that smelled faintly of perfume and smoke. And one night, while the wind sighed through the cracks in my wall, I thought I heard a breath, soft, human, too close. I froze. My needle hovered in the air. The flame trembled. Then silence again. I told myself it was the wind, but in my chest, I knew it wasn't. Still I continued. I had come too far to stop. The night before the final stitch, I stood over the dress, my eyes blurring from exhaustion. It was finished, a creation born from faith and pain. I whispered a prayer over it. "Let them see me now, Mama." For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to rest. When dawn crept through the window, I woke to a silence that didn't belong. The air felt heavy, the light wrong. My chest tightened as I turned toward the table, and everything inside me collapsed. The gown was gone, torn apart in shreds, the silk stained with mud and blood. My sketches lay in ashes near the cold fire pit, and on the wall, pinned with my mother's scissors, was a strip of burnt fabric, and written in ash across it were 3 words that stole my breath. "Stay forgotten, Tailor." Some nights arrive carrying ghosts instead of dreams, and that night the wind brought her. She came through the dark like a memory I had forgotten to remember, her steps soft enough to make even silence lean closer to listen. I didn't know her name, but something in the air told me my story had just changed its writer. The night after my world was torn apart, I sat inside the broken ribs of my hut, surrounded by silence that felt too heavy to breathe in. The once white silk, my masterpiece, now lay scattered across the floor like the aftermath of a battle. Torn edges fluttered whenever the wind sighed through the cracks in the wall. I watched them move and thought of everything I'd lost, my pride, my hope, and the last dream my mother had taught me to protect. The lamp had burned out hours ago. Only the moonlight remained, spilling through the window and falling on the gold coins I didn't have, the recognition I never received, and the ashes of sketches I'd drawn with trembling hands. Every corner of the room seemed to whisper, "You were a fool to believe." But the silence was suddenly interrupted, not by thunder, not by a knock, but by something softer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and strangely graceful, like someone who had never learned to hurry. I froze. My breath caught halfway in my throat. No one came here at night, especially not to see a failed tailor. The last time someone had crossed that threshold uninvited, they had left me with ruins. I reached for my scissors, my hands shaking, my pulse quick and uneven. The door creaked open before I could speak. A draft of cold air swept in, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and rain, the kind of scent that doesn't belong to this side of poverty. And then she appeared. A woman, cloaked in shadow and silk, her face hidden behind a thin black veil that shimmered when the moonlight touched it. Her movements were slow, deliberate, not like someone walking into a stranger's home, but like someone walking through a memory she'd already seen before. She didn't knock. She didn't ask. She simply entered, as though she had been expected. I wanted to speak, but my voice betrayed me. She moved past me without a glance, her attention caught by the torn remains of the dress lying on the floor. She knelt, her hand hovering above the silk as if afraid her touch might wake it. Then, with the gentleness of a mother lifting a wounded child, she picked up a single strip of fabric, brushed away the dust, and held it against the light. "This," she whispered, her voice smooth but carrying a sadness I couldn't name. "This is the most honest thing I've ever seen." Her words landed softly, yet they struck deeper than any insult ever had. I stared at her, unsure whether to thank her or demand answers. "It was supposed to be a queen's gown," I said bitterly. "Now it's just another ghost on the floor." She turned to face me then, her veil catching the light. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her eyes, calm, sharp, and ancient, like someone who had seen too much and learned to hide everything behind grace. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "the gods tore it apart, so that when you stitch it again, it will belong not to a queen, but to destiny." I blinked, unsure whether I'd heard her right. Without another word, she reached into the folds of her cloak and drew out a small pouch. When she dropped it onto my work table, the sound of gold filled the air. Heavy, cold, real. I stared, confused. "I don't want your money." She tilted her head, her tone neither kind nor cruel. "It's not payment," she said softly. "It's faith." "Faith in what?" "In you," she replied, "and in the story that refuses to end." Her hand brushed against the torn silk one last time. "Finish it again," she whispered. "Make it as if it were born from your blood, not your hands. When you're done, you'll know where to bring it." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned toward the door. The light of the moon caught on the edge of her cloak, illuminating the tiniest glimmer of embroidery. Gold thread woven into symbols so intricate, they seemed alive. "Wait," I said, stepping forward, my heart racing. "Who are you?" She paused in the doorway. For a moment it seemed she might answer, but instead she said only, "You've already met me. Just not yet." And with that, she disappeared into the night. I rushed to the door, my heart hammering, but the road outside was empty, bathed in silver light. The only sign she had ever been there was the faint scent of jasmine clinging to the air, and something else. On the ground where she had stood, a strip of moonlight fell perfectly across the hem of her cloak that had caught on a nail. I bent to lift it, and my breath caught. Embroidered in gold was the royal crest of the kingdom. The mysterious woman wasn't a stranger at all. She was someone who lived behind palace walls. They say the finest creations are born in palaces, but they lie. The truest art rises from ashes, from hands that tremble yet refuse to stop. That night, when I looked around my broken hut, it wasn't a home anymore. It was a battlefield, and my heart was the only soldier left standing. Everything I had ever loved had burned, but somewhere deep inside that ruin, a stubborn spark refused to die. The night she left, the woman in the veil with a voice soft as prophecy, her words stayed behind, echoing louder than the silence. "Finish what you started." They haunted me long after she vanished into the mist. I sat among the debris of my life, my fingers tracing the torn edges of the fabric that had once been my dream, and I realized something I had never dared to admit. Pain doesn't destroy the artist. It completes him. When dawn came, it wasn't gentle. The light pushed through the cracks of my roof like 1,000 accusing eyes, illuminating my failure in cruel gold. My dress was gone, my pride shattered, but the ashes on the floor still glowed faintly, and I took that as a sign. Maybe the gods hadn't abandoned me. Maybe they were testing if I could create beauty from the wreckage they left behind. I began again. I walked to the market barefoot, the red dust of the earth clinging to my feet. People stared as I rummaged through piles of discarded fabric, burnt lace, and broken ornaments that once adorned someone else's wealth. They laughed when they saw me searching for treasure in the trash. "The tailor's lost his mind," someone whispered. "He's sowing ghosts now." I said nothing. Madness and genius often wear the same face before the world learns the difference. I returned home carrying only scraps: charred silk, dull beads, a threadbare ribbon once touched by rain. I laid them across the table, and though they were ruined, they shimmered faintly under the candlelight. I touched them, and for a moment, I swore they breathed. I could feel the heartbeat of the cloth, soft, persistent, defiant. I smiled then, the kind of smile that belongs to a man who's already lost everything and has nothing left to fear. The nights became my companion. I worked through them, each stitch a confession, each seam a silent scream. My fingers blistered, bled, and healed again. My candle burned lower with every sunrise, yet I never noticed, because something divine had taken over my hands. The gown began to grow, not as it once was, but as it should have been, no longer pale and perfect. Now it glowed in shades of gold and flame, like dusk caught in silk. It wasn't a dress anymore. It was rebirth made visible. When I touched it, I felt warmth. When I looked at it, I saw the truth. It was as if the fire that had once devoured my dreams now lived inside them. And I understood. Pain had not been my punishment. It had been my teacher. Days blurred into nights, nights into devotion. I forgot hunger, forgot sleep, forgot even the sound of my own voice. My world became thread and flame, sorrow and purpose. And when the final stitch slid through the fabric, the candle beside me flickered as though bowing in reverence. The gown was alive. It shimmered like fire seen through tears, fragile yet unbreakable. Every fold caught light like memory. Every bead reflected something human: struggle, love, faith, loss. I stared at it and whispered to myself, if this is madness, then may I never be sane again. And then I remembered her words. You'll know where to bring it. That night, guided only by instinct and moonlight, I wrapped the gown in linen and walked the long path toward the palace. The road was silent, the air sharp with jasmine and anticipation. My heart beat like a drum that wanted to warn me, but I didn't listen. I walked until dirt beneath my feet turned to marble, until the stars were reflected in gold gates too grand to belong to any mortal. I stopped before the smaller servants' entrance, half hidden behind the palace gardens. My hand trembled as I lifted the gown to knock. For a moment I hesitated, a poor man holding a masterpiece before the gates of power. But my mother's voice came back to me. Even kings wear dreams, stitched by the forgotten. I knocked 3 times. The sound echoed through the night. The door opened slightly, just enough to reveal a flicker of candlelight and the scent of roses. I stepped forward, careful, reverent, my heart full of both faith and fear. Before I could take another step, the silence shattered. The glow of torches flared from both sides, and suddenly, armored men filled the shadows. Their spears gleamed, their eyes cold and sharp. One of them stepped closer, his voice heavy with accusation. "Who are you?" he demanded. "To walk into the Queen's private chamber unbidden." I froze, the gown still in my hands. And then I saw it, the royal crest on their armor. My breath faltered as realization sank in. I hadn't delivered the dress to the woman in the veil. I had walked straight into the Queen's forbidden quarters. They said queens are born to rule, but they never said what it costs to wear a crown forged from other people's dreams. Before she wore jewels, she wore chains, invisible, golden, and heavy with expectation. And when she lifted her veil that night, I saw no monarch standing before me, only a woman quietly suffocating beneath her own throne. The chamber was drenched in candlelight, each flame dancing like a secret afraid to be seen. The air carried the scent of lavender and old iron, soft beauty tangled with quiet danger. My heart still pounded from the guards' hands that had dragged me here, and the gown I'd created My entire life, stitched into silk, lay folded on the marble floor, looking almost holy beneath the golden light. Then the door creaked open. She entered, the woman from the veil. Only now, she wasn't veiled at all. The flicker of candles caught the curve of her face, the depth of her eyes, and the quiet authority in her every movement. The guards froze when she raised her hand. Her voice, though calm, carried a command sharper than any blade. "Leave us." They obeyed instantly. The door closed, and the silence that followed felt alive, thick, waiting, breathing. She turned to me, her bare feet whispering against the floor as she stepped closer. "You're trembling," she said softly, her accent a blend of royalty and fatigue. "Do I frighten you, Tailor?" I swallowed hard. "I've never stood this close to power, Your Majesty." She smiled faintly, but not the way queens do when they are pleased. It was a fragile smile, the kind worn by someone who has practiced it too long to remember what real joy feels like. "Power," she murmured, "is a cage with gold bars. Beautiful, but it still keeps you from the world." She stopped in front of the gown and knelt, her fingers gliding over the threads I had bled for. For a moment her eyes softened, wide with something almost childlike. "You made this?" "Yes," I said quietly, with what I had left. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "No one's ever made something for me that wasn't trying to own me." I didn't understand then, but the sadness in her tone sank into me like rain through cloth. She stood again, her gaze heavy with unspoken truth. "My name is Amara," she said, "but the world calls me Queen because it's easier than remembering I'm human." I looked at her then, really looked, and saw it all, the loneliness hiding behind the gold, the grief veiled in grace. She moved toward the tall window, where moonlight spilled across her gown like a blessing she didn't believe in. "They think this wedding is a love story," she said bitterly. "But love has no place in politics. I am the peace they signed, the jewel they display. My smile keeps 2 kingdoms from burning. But every time I wear it, I feel less alive." Her words cracked something inside me. I wanted to speak, to offer comfort. But what could a poor tailor say to a queen who'd been turned into an ornament? So I stood in silence, my heart echoing with her pain. Then she turned sharply. "I want you to keep working for me," she said. "In secret, away from the eyes that would twist your gift into treason. You will make the gown I will wear, not as their puppet, but as the woman I still am beneath the crown." Her words left me breathless. "If they find out." She cut me off, her tone a whisper sharpened by fear. "They won't, because no one will believe a queen would trust a forgotten tailor." She paused, then stepped closer until I could see the reflection of my own trembling hands in her eyes. "Your stitches carry something mine never could. Truth, and I need that more than beauty." For a long moment, we stood in silence. The pauper and the queen, 2 prisoners bound by different kinds of chains. Then she reached out and brushed her fingers against my sleeve, the faintest touch, but enough to feel the weight of her trembling. "You'll help me, won't you, Kofi?" "I will," I whispered, though the promise felt like stepping into fire. Her hand lingered a second longer, then she leaned closer, her breath trembling against my ear. "But you must understand something," she said, voice barely a whisper. "If the council ever learns who stitched this fabric, who touched what only royalty should touch." Her eyes darkened with dread. "They won't ask for your name, Kofi. They'll hang you by the thread you used, for daring to touch royal silk. They say beauty lives in the light, but that's a lie told by those who've never stitched in darkness. True, beauty is born where no one dares to look, in the trembling hands that create, in the quiet hearts that bleed unseen. And that night, beneath a palace of gold and silence, 2 souls touched forbidden fire and mistook it for destiny. The night inside the palace felt different from all others. Too still, too watchful. The kind of stillness that comes before revelation or ruin. Deep below its glittering corridors, past forgotten doors and hollow halls where cobwebs hung like old memories, a hidden chamber waited. There, amid the scent of dust, wax, and jasmine, I bent over silk that shimmered like trapped moonlight. And across from me, the queen of an empire, Amara herself, knelt barefoot on the cold stone floor, threading her destiny through a needle's eye. By day she was untouchable, a figure carved in marble and protocol. But down here, stripped of titles and guards, she was something else entirely. Her laughter was quieter than a sigh, her eyes heavy with dreams she was never allowed to speak. Sometimes, when the lamplight flickered across her face, I could see the girl she used to be, the one who'd once believed freedom was something a crown could give, not take. "This dress," she whispered, running her fingers over the silk. "They think it will make me beautiful. But beauty is just the mask they make women wear before they cage them." Her words hung between us, soft and defiant. I didn't know how to answer, so I let the thread speak for me. My stitches found rhythm, gentle, deliberate, each one a quiet rebellion. Every pull of the needle drew our worlds closer together, binding her loneliness to my silence. We worked through nights that felt endless, through storms that rattled the palace gates. In those hidden hours, she told me about her childhood, about painting skies with her fingers and sneaking away to watch the seamstresses work, envying their freedom to create instead of command. I told her about my mother's death, about the market that mocked my poverty, about the broken scissors that became my inheritance and my curse. And through it all, something unspoken began to grow, fragile as silk, fierce as flame. One night, she reached for my hand without thinking. Our fingers brushed, only for a second. But in that second, the world outside vanished. There was no crown, no title, no poverty, no law. Only two hearts that had spent too long pretending not to want to be seen. "Do you ever wonder," she murmured, "if the gods ever feel lonely too?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because if I spoke, the truth would escape, that I'd fallen in love with someone I could never touch again. We returned to our work in silence, though every heartbeat felt like a confession. The gown began to take shape, a thing of impossible beauty, glowing like dusk caught in fabric. It wasn't a dress for a queen. It was a poem written in silk, about pain and courage and love that had no name. But even in silence, danger has its own language. That same night, after Amara left for her chambers, I stayed behind to finish the embroidery. The candles burned low, the shadows growing longer, breathing heavier. I didn't notice at first. The faint creak of the hidden door, the whisper of boots on stone. A shadow moved behind me. "Kofi," a voice said, smooth as honey, sharp as a blade. "Still sewing fairy tales?" I turned. Dio stood there, the palace's royal designer, my old rival, his smile colder than the metal scissors in his hand. His gaze fell on the gown spread before me, and for a moment, jealousy carved itself deep into his face. "So, this is the queen's secret," he murmured. "A poor man's art hidden beneath her crown." He stepped closer, his eyes gleaming. "You've forgotten your place, Kofi. You think a queen will save you when the truth comes out?" He laughed, low, venomous, and turned toward my work table. His fingers brushed over my thread spool, the one I had used for every stitch. He rolled it between his fingers, studying its sheen. "Such a fine thread," he said. "Too fine for a man like you." I lunged forward, but he stepped back, smirking. "Don't worry," he said. "I won't destroy your work. I'm an artist too, remember?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "I'll just improve it." He placed the spool down, gently, too gently, and walked toward the exit. The echo of his footsteps faded, leaving behind only the hum of the candlelight and the thundering of my pulse. When I picked up the spool again, the thread gleamed unnaturally beneath the flame. Not gold, but tinged with something darker. I lifted it closer and caught a faint, metallic scent that made my throat tighten. My stomach turned cold as realization struck. The thread wasn't thread anymore. It was laced with poison ink, and the next stitch I made would not adorn the queen. It would kill her. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with daggers or deceitful words. Sometimes it hides in silk, smiling quietly as you pour your soul into it. That night, the air inside the hidden chamber felt heavy, thick with the kind of silence that only comes before something holy breaks. And as I pulled the final stitch through the queen's gown, I realized too late. I wasn't sewing a dream anymore. I was sewing my own ruin. The world outside the palace slept beneath a pale moon, but inside those stone walls, time had forgotten how to breathe. The chamber flickered with faint candlelight, the flames bending like servants bowing to the queen's beauty and my desperation. The air smelled of wax, lavender, and something faintly metallic, a warning I mistook for exhaustion. My hands, rough from years of mending rags, trembled as they danced over silk softer than breath. Every pull of the needle drew the gown closer to completion, and drew something darker into being. The fabric shimmered under my touch, not white, not gold, but a shade that lived somewhere between sunrise and ashes. I thought it was magic. I thought it was for a purpose. I didn't realize it was death. Queen Amara sat quietly across from me, her veil cast aside, her eyes alive with something I'd never seen before. Trust. She'd traded her throne's caution for a human heartbeat, and in that trade, she had unknowingly given me the most fragile gift a man like me could hold. Belief. "You've done the impossible," she whispered, tracing the edge of the gown with trembling fingers. "It feels like it's breathing." Her words lingered, haunting and proud, as if the silk truly had a pulse. I smiled faintly, pretending not to notice the sting beginning to bloom beneath my fingertips. It started as a warmth, a whisper of pain no different from a pinprick. But as I worked the needle through the final seam, the warmth deepened, burning, spreading, crawling under my skin like fire made of ink. I stopped. My hands shook. The thread shimmered faintly beneath the candlelight, gold, yet wrong. When I rubbed my fingers together, the residue it left behind wasn't dust or dye. It was black, oily, alive. "Your Majesty," I said, my voice breaking, "don't touch it." The queen looked at me, startled. "Why? What's wrong?" I turned my palms toward her, and she gasped. My skin was darkening before her eyes, veins tracing upward like vines of shadow. Panic rose in my chest. Not for myself, but for her. "The thread," I stammered. "It's not what it seems. Someone's—" The words never finished. The chamber doors exploded open. Guards stormed in like thunder, their armor flashing cold steel. And behind them, draped in silk darker than night, stood Dio, the royal designer, my old rival, wearing triumph like a crown. His voice was calm, almost kind. "Step away from the queen." Amara stood, her voice trembling with fury. "Dio, what is this? You have no right." "I have every right," he interrupted smoothly, holding up a folded parchment sealed with the royal crest. "By order of the council, I'm to inspect all materials related to the royal wedding, especially those handled by outsiders." His eyes found me, and his lips curved into a smirk that smelled of victory. Or should I say, traitors? Before I could speak, 2 guards seized my arms. My half-finished words turned into gasps as pain flared through my hands, the black ink burning hotter now, crawling up toward my heart. Dio stepped closer, inspecting the gown. His voice dripped with false pity. "Such a shame. The queen trusted you, and you repay her with poison." Amara's eyes widened. "No! He would never—" But the guards were already dragging me away. Her voice broke through the chaos, pleading, echoing against the stone walls. "Stop. He saved me. He—" Dio raised a hand, silencing her with authority. "Take him to the dungeon. By dawn, we'll have his confession." The last thing I saw as they dragged me through the golden corridors was her face, pale, helpless, framed by the gown that shimmered like a living ghost. The dungeon was not made for time. It was made for forgetting. Stone pressed against my skin, iron bit into my wrists, and the air smelled of rust and prayer. I could still feel the sting in my veins, but worse than pain was the silence. The silence that followed trust once it had been broken. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, days, or maybe eternity, before I heard the faintest sound. Footsteps, too light for a soldier. The door creaked, and a thin sliver of light spilled in. A young servant appeared, trembling, eyes darting like a trapped bird. He said nothing. He only pressed a folded scrap of fabric into my palm and disappeared into the dark again. I opened it slowly, afraid of what it might mean. It was a piece of silk, torn from her gown, warm, still faintly scented with jasmine and candle smoke. But it wasn't the fabric that stole my breath. It was the message stitched into it, in small, uneven thread, hurried but deliberate. "The dress still breathes." I stared at it until my vision blurred, my hands trembling around the message like it was alive. The black ink on my skin pulsed faintly, echoing the rhythm of those words. Somewhere deep beneath the palace, I felt it. A hum in the air, a heartbeat not my own. The gown was not poisoned. It was awake, and whatever it had become, it was calling for me. They said the palace bells would ring for love, but I swear, when they echoed across the city that morning, they didn't sound like joy. They sounded like chains made of gold. The day of the royal wedding was born beneath a sky too beautiful to trust, and every ray of sunlight that touched the marble halls hid a shadow that would soon bleed. The capital woke before dawn. Drums rolled through the valleys, the air alive with chants and perfume, and the roads to the palace shimmered under rivers of petals. From the poorest child to the richest noble, everyone wore color, gold, crimson, ivory, all believing they were witnesses to a fairy tale. But fairy tales die quietly in palaces. They rot behind painted doors. Beneath those doors, Queen Amara sat before a mirror taller than herself, the reflection of a woman dressed for destiny, but with eyes that belonged to a prisoner. Servants pinned jewels into her hair as the royal designer Dio circled her like a vulture made of silk and pride. His voice was coated in honey, his words rehearsed. "Your Majesty," he said, smoothing the skirt that shimmered like sunlight trapped in fabric. "This gown will be remembered for centuries." Amara's eyes didn't move. So will the lie that made it. Dio's smile froze, but he bowed slightly. "Truth is heavy, Your Majesty. Lies are easier to dance in." She didn't answer. Her gaze fell to the gown, flawless, breathtaking, soulless. Every bead was perfect, every fold sculpted, but it carried no heartbeat. It was a beautiful corpse. The dress Kofi had stitched with blood and honesty was gone, stolen, reborn in gold. Her fingers brushed the silk, and for an instant she swore she felt it twitch beneath her hand, as if some small ghost still breathed within its threads. Trumpets thundered. The ceremony had begun. Outside, the city's great bells tolled, their sound rolling like thunder over the roofs. Nobles filled the marble hall. Ministers, generals, priests, and the kind of men who clap for anything that shines. The floor reflected the queen as she entered, her gown catching the sunlight like a slow fire. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "A vision," they whispered. "A goddess." None of them noticed the sadness etched around her mouth, the tremor in her steps. Dio stood proudly near the throne, bowing as she passed. To the watching world, he was the genius behind her glory. To her, he was the thief who'd carved the soul from something sacred. As she reached the altar, the priest raised his hands. The king, older, heavy, dressed in victory, smiled like a man collecting another treasure. He spoke vows that tasted of politics, not devotion. Amara's voice trembled as she repeated them, each word feeling less like promise and more like surrender. And then, as the final blessing began, the air changed. It started as a whisper, a single tremor in the fabric around her wrists, then another. The silk shivered, not like cloth moved by breeze, but like something alive. Her heartbeat quickened. Beneath the folds of gold, warmth spread, then heat, then pain. She gasped. Dio frowned. The priest paused. The guests murmured, unsure. And then it happened. The hem of the gown darkened, the gold bleeding into gray, then black. The seams quivered, the embroidery twisted as if rejecting the body it clung to. A low, wet sound filled the hall, the sound of fabric weeping ink. The black spread upward like vines, curling across her waist, her arms, her chest. Gasps filled the air as the crowd recoiled. Dio's face was drained of color. No, impossible, he whispered. Amara's knees gave way. She clutched her stomach, the ink staining her fingers. The guards surged forward, the priest shouted prayers, and chaos drowned the music. Dio stumbled back, eyes wide with terror as the queen's trembling voice rose through the noise, weak, defiant, breaking. "This is not your creation," she whispered, her gaze locking on Dio. "The truth remembers who made it." Her body collapsed. The hall fell silent, the kind of silence that swallows light. As she hit the marble floor, the gown moved again, pulsing, breathing, alive. Black ink spread outward in perfect circles, staining the aisle where lies had been blessed. Up in the royal balcony, one of the chandeliers flickered. And deep beneath the palace, in the darkness of my cell, I felt the ground tremble. The heartbeat I'd once sewn into silk was calling home. They said his hands were cursed, the same hands that once mended the torn, now accused of breaking a queen. But what they didn't know was that destiny sometimes bleeds through wounds, and when they dragged Kofi into the throne room that morning, his palms still burned with the proof of truth, the truth no one dared to touch. The palace was no longer a home of gold. It was a cage wrapped in silence. The once bright corridors smelled of smoke and incense, a poor disguise for fear. Outside, the people waited beyond the iron gates, whispering that the queen's wedding had turned into a funeral. But inside, under the blinding light of the throne hall, a different kind of death was about to unfold. The death of innocence. The great doors opened with a scream of rusted hinges. Chains clinked. And there he was, Kofi, barefoot, bloodied, a ghost of the man who once stitched dreams out of scraps. The guards shoved him forward, his knees striking the cold marble. The nobles watched from above like vultures in silk robes, their faces masks of disgust and curiosity. The king sat tall upon his throne, his crown gleaming like judgment. "Bring forth the traitor," he commanded, his voice deep enough to shake the room. Kofi raised his head slowly. His lips were cracked, his eyes sunken. Yet behind that exhaustion flickered something indestructible. "You call me traitor," he said, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "But I only ever served beauty, not power." A murmur rippled through the court. The royal designer Dio stood nearby, pretending to hide behind humility, though pride gleamed in his smirk. He leaned toward the king. "He deceives you, Majesty. The queen's collapse. It was his doing. The fabric itself was poisoned." "Silence him," the king ordered. "Let him confess before his punishment." The guards yanked Kofi's chains tight. His wrists bled anew, drops staining the marble like ink. Still he looked up, not at the king, not at the court, but at the queen. She sat pale and still beside the throne, her face hidden behind a thin white veil. Everyone thought she was barely alive, but her eyes, when they met Kofi's, were sharp with something else entirely. Truth. "I have nothing to confess," Kofi said, each word a thread pulled from pain. "The only poison in that gown was greed, and it did not come from my hands." The king slammed his staff. "Enough." But before the guards could strike, the royal healer, Old Grey, trembling with wisdom, stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing deeply, "I have examined the silk of the queen's gown. The thread was laced with poison, but only after the sewing. The one who crafted it would have been burned by it." The court fell silent. The healer turned to Kofi, gesturing toward his bandaged hands. "Show them," he said softly. Kofi hesitated, then raised his trembling hands. The room gasped. His palms were raw and blistered, the skin blackened where the poison had kissed it. "He did not harm Her Majesty," the healer continued. "He suffered to save her." All eyes turned toward Dio. For the first time, his perfect composure cracked. "Lies," he shouted. "The man's a fraud, a cursed fool." But the king's expression wavered. The silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. Then a sound broke it, the slow rustle of silk. The queen was rising. Her attendants tried to stop her, but she brushed them aside. Her veil slipped, revealing a face ghostly pale, yet fierce with purpose. She took a single step forward, the sound of her bare feet echoing through the hall. "This man," she said, voice trembling but clear, "did not poison me. He warned me. He tried to save me, even when I would not listen." The court erupted. Nobles gasped. Soldiers exchanged glances. The king froze mid-breath. Dio stumbled back, his hand gripping his chest as if the truth itself had struck him. The queen looked directly at him. "The ink that bled through my gown was not death. It was the truth trying to escape your lies." In the stunned silence that followed, the ground trembled. One of the guards' torches flickered, and behind the throne, the folded remnants of the gown began to stir. A soft pulse ran through it, faint but alive, like a heartbeat reborn in silk. The courtiers backed away in terror as the queen whispered, "The dress still breathes." And for the first time, even the king's voice fell silent, because something greater than power had begun to awaken in that hall. They said a poor man's hands had no place in a palace, yet those same wounded hands held together the very seams of a kingdom on the verge of collapse. Sometimes, destiny doesn't roar into your life. It bleeds through your fingertips, one stitch at a time, until even the crown must bow before its quiet power. The palace that morning was carved in silence. The marble halls that once echoed with wedding songs now whispered with fear. Servants moved like ghosts, nobles avoided each other's eyes, and somewhere beyond the courtyard, the people gathered in restless murmurs, wondering if the gods had finally turned their faces away from the throne. Inside the throne room, Kofi stood in chains, his body trembling, but not from fear, from exhaustion. His fingers were bandaged, the burns still raw from the poisoned thread that had almost taken his life. Yet even through the pain, his gaze held something no chain could steal: dignity. Across the room, Queen Amara sat upon the golden seat, pale but unbroken. The events of the cursed wedding still haunted the air, her collapse, the screams, the rumors of witchcraft. And now, all eyes were on the tailor who had once been invisible. The king's voice shattered the tension. "You stand accused of treachery," he thundered, his tone forged in pride. "Of poisoning the queen's gown, of defiling royal silk with your cursed touch. Speak, peasant. Why should your life be spared?" Kofi lifted his head slowly, his voice calm. Too calm. "Because sometimes," he said, "a curse is just a truth people fear to touch." A wave of murmurs swept the court. Dio, the royal designer, stepped forward, feigning righteous fury. "He dares to speak in riddles, Your Majesty. He is the reason her grace suffered. I warned you, his kind brings ruin." But before the king could answer, a fragile voice cut through the noise. "Enough." It was the queen. Every sound in the chamber died. Even the torches seemed to bow their flames lower. She stood, weak, trembling, but radiant in defiance. "You all speak of poison," she said, her eyes sharp as glass. "But not one of you asked where it came from." She turned to the healer, who stepped forward, holding a folded piece of silk in his trembling hands. "Your Majesties," he began, "I examined the gown. The toxin was applied to the thread after it was sewn. It was not the work of the tailor's hands." The king frowned, uncertain. "Then who—" The healer continued, voice growing stronger. "The very stitching that this man made, his humble, careful work, trapped the poison in its seams. Had it not been for the precision of his hand, the toxin would have spread through Her Majesty's skin within minutes. His stitches did not kill her. They saved her." The words hung heavy in the air, too heavy to move. The court fell silent. All eyes shifted from the healer to Kofi, the broken man in chains who had unknowingly saved the woman who ruled over him. Dio's confident smirk began to melt, his lips trembling as sweat gathered at his brow. The queen descended the steps slowly, her crown catching the morning light like a flame refusing to die. She stopped before Kofi, looking down at him, not as a ruler to a servant, but as a soul to another soul. "You carried truth in your hands," she whispered, while others carried deceit in theirs. She turned to the guards. "Release him." The clatter of chains striking marble rang louder than any royal trumpet. Kofi rose, his knees weak, his eyes glistening with disbelief. The nobles whispered in shock, their carefully built walls of arrogance beginning to crumble. The queen turned her gaze upon Dio. "And you," she said, her voice no longer trembling. "You painted lies in gold. You poisoned silk to kill what you could never create. Purity. Take him away." Guards moved swiftly, seizing the royal designer. His protests echoed uselessly as he was dragged from the hall, the sound of his downfall swallowed by silence. Then she turned back to Kofi, the man whose every scar was now a royal confession. "The gown you made was never finished," she said softly. "It was meant to be worn once for vanity, but I want it to be completed again, not for beauty, but for redemption." Kofi lowered his gaze, his voice breaking. "Your Majesty, I have nothing left to give but the truth stitched into my pain." The queen smiled faintly. "Then give the world that truth. Let your stitches tell them what survival looks like." The queen stepped closer, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "Let the world see what love stitched through suffering looks like." Outside, thunder rolled across the skies as if the gods themselves were listening. And as the queen walked away, Kofi looked down at his burned palms, the same hands that once begged for work, now chosen to remake a kingdom's soul. But beyond the palace walls, a shadow moved among the people, a spy watching, waiting, because some wounds, no matter how beautiful, were never meant to heal. They called him invisible, a man born in dust, forgotten in corners, unworthy of silk or sunlight. Yet on the day the palace gates opened again, even the gods seemed to hold their breath. For the tailor they mocked was about to finish what destiny had begun, to stitch not a gown, but the memory of a nation that almost forgot its soul. The morning rose heavy with silence, the kind that follows both tragedy and rebirth. The palace walls still remembered the cries of the wedding that had turned to mourning. But this dawn felt different, gentler, like the first sigh after a storm. Gold spilled through stained glass windows, laying soft light on a man who once worked by candle and hunger. Kofi stood in the queen's atelier, a vast chamber perfumed with jasmine and quiet awe. His scarred hands trembled as he held the fabric that would change everything. The silk shimmered faintly, not pure white, but kissed by smoke, a deliberate imperfection he had chosen to remember where the journey began. For weeks, he had stitched in silence, alone except for the sound of his heartbeat. He had worked with no apprentices, no servants, no gold, only memory. Every thread carried a story: his mother's laughter, the burns of betrayal, the weight of forgiveness. Sometimes the pain returned as he sewed, but he let it. It guided him, reminded him of what truth costs. When he finished, he stood before the gown, not in pride, but in disbelief. It was not a dress. It was a living confession. The bodice bore delicate patterns of thorns and roses entwined. The sleeves mirrored flames fading into dawn, and along the hem ran a single stitched line of words so faint you could only see them when light touched them right. Beauty belongs to the broken who choose to mend. When Queen Amara entered the room, she stopped as if struck by silence itself. Her eyes, still carrying the shadows of the past, softened as they fell upon the gown. "It feels alive," she whispered. Kofi bowed his head. "Because it was born from everything that refused to die." "For a long time," she said, "nothing." Then, turning to the guards, she commanded, "Open the palace gates. Let the people see what truth looks like when it's worn, without shame." By midday, the courtyard was overflowing. Word had traveled faster than any trumpet. The queen would appear again, and beside her, the tailor whose name the kingdom had once spat like a curse. Merchants abandoned their stalls, children climbed onto shoulders, old women clutched amulets, praying they'd see a miracle. Then the drums began. The gates opened, and sunlight poured through like a river of gold. Queen Amara stepped out first, her gown breathing in the light, soft fire in motion, silk flowing like water over stone. She walked not as a monarch flaunting her glory, but as a woman reborn, her every step a quiet apology to the people she had once ruled from afar. And then, behind her, came Kofi. He wore no jewels, no robe, only a simple tunic, the same brown as the earth beneath their feet. His hands still bore the marks of thread and toil, yet when the people saw him, something ancient stirred in them. They did not cheer. They knelt. At first it was one, a child clutching her mother's hand. Then 10, then hundreds. Soon the entire courtyard bowed, not to the crown, but to the man who had stitched their pain into something beautiful. The queen turned, her voice trembling. "They don't bow for me, Kofi," she said. "They bow for the truth you made visible." Kofi's throat tightened, his vision blurred with tears. The chants rose, his name spoken not as pity, but as reverence. The man who once slept on floors of sawdust and thread now stood taller than the marble spires around him. The king stepped forward, humbled, his pride finally stripped of its armor. "This gown," he said to the crowd, "is not just royal silk. It is our mirror, the reflection of what we forgot to honor, the hands that build, the hearts that bleed, the souls that forgive." As the sun reached its highest point, the gown caught firelight once more, not burning, but glowing, alive with the breath of every soul it represented. Kofi looked at the queen, and she smiled through tears. "You didn't just mend a dress," she said. "You rewrote your destiny." The crowd erupted, bells rang, drums thundered, the air trembling with rebirth. And as Kofi looked to the sky, the wind carried the truth the world would never forget. The poor man everyone ignored had become the needle that rewrote the destiny of a crown. If this story touched something deep inside you, don't let it end here. Comment below what part of Kofi's journey spoke to your heart. Your words keep these stories alive. Your voice gives them power. And if you believe even the smallest hands can change a kingdom, like, share, and subscribe to stand with every unseen dreamer who still stitches hope in silence.